Welcome to the Will to Power podcast. I am your host, Nick Vital. Before I begin, I want to start with a land acknowledgement. I want to acknowledge that I am on conquered land. It's probably been conquered a dozen or 100 times already by different groups throughout all of human history. And to complain about it today is a salty cope, usually made by losers or virtue-signaling insufferable people. Now, with that out of the way, please do me a favor, like, subscribe, and let's begin. Okay, this week we are talking about right-wing identity politics. What that means exactly. Before we get into the right-wing version of identity politics, I think it's important to talk about left-wing identity politics because up until this point, they've dominated that field, right? Identity politics is their game. So we have to understand what they're playing. Now, left-wing identity politics, a lot of it is based in this notion that the personal is political, right? Your lived experiences, who you are, kind of defines everything. And they've taken this to a crazy extreme recently where it's, it doesn't matter what you say, it kind of matters who you are. Anything that you say is kind of filtered through how they perceive your identity. So they kind of base everything on these very two-dimensional caricatures drawn from basically 20th century anti-colonial literature, right? You have the white male colonizer oppressors, people of color, woman victims. And, so if you're, basically this amounts to if you're of this oppressor group, nothing you say matters, essentially. And it's an interesting way to look at the world, right? It definitely makes it easy to process, right? It's a kind of mid-wit level thinking where it's you don't really have to put in a whole lot of thought, right? You kind of look at who it is and you make the determination. And of course it goes a little bit deeper than that too, where they'll kind of make associations. So they'll say something like Larry Elder is white, or because of his politics. But needless to say, everything that they hear is kind of filtered through this notion of the personal is political. So if you're a man, of course, everything you say is going to be sexist and misogynist. If you're a white person, everything you say is going to be racist and colored through that. And nothing else really matters. So it becomes this large performative game of who's the most oppressed, becomes, who has the most right to speak. And it's ultimately silly. And even within the left, it's pretty asinine, right? It kind of interferes with them actually being able to effectively unify and forward goals, because there's always this infighting about, oh, well, you're saying this, but, you're a cisgendered person and yada, yada, yada. But nonetheless, this is very difficult to wade through as an outsider, right? Because they'll use this logic where it's like, if you're a white man and if you say you're not a racist, well, that just proves you're a racist. It's a kind of cult-like thinking, right? It is a cult-like thinking. It's this notion that if you disagree with what you say, then that proves you're the enemy and you're against us, sort of mentality. It's very similar, the whole witch trials, right? If you deny that you're in league with the devil, well, that means, you're a liar and you're in league with the devil. It's kind of like the denial is the denial is the evidence of guilt, sort of thing. So, and it also ends up in really interesting ways, too, where it's you have these white people, usually young white men, low-status white men, who have learned from a young age that they can get attention, acclaim, and, kind of get validated through histrionically defending other people, right? So you get these people, these kind of white TikTok people who go on and on and on about, white privilege and white supremacy and all of these things. And it's largely performative, and it kind of amounts to this, right? This is the kind of the baseline logic. White people are bad, except for me, because I'm telling you I'm bad. Right? That's essentially where they're coming from. And moreover, white people who don't think that white people are bad are worse than white people who think that white people are bad. It's so fucking convoluted. But this is what you end up with when it comes to left-wing identity politics, right? It's kind of all this kind of scale, this gradation, this wheel of oppression sort of view of the world, where people's supposed place in different static hierarchies determines their value and their worth. And it's even fucked up on that level, right? Because it's based on that notion that to be oppressed is a virtue. To live in poverty is a virtue. I've seen people in poverty. It's not virtuous, And I'm not just talking about guys on Skid Row either. I've been to villages where it's people in mud huts, dirt walls. And I would argue to an extent, they're probably a little bit happier than people in the West with all the kind of low-grade anxiety, low-grade pressure of the modern world. But nonetheless, there's not really a lot of virtue in living in a home with mud walls and kind of being, an ethnic minority or kind of oppressed minority in whatever country you're in, living in some rural shithole. Nonetheless, the left kind of forms this sort of atonement cult where it's like they create this view of this world based on like oppression, and then because nobody's going to be perfect in this. Nobody, there's very few people that's like the Guatemalan lesbian, transgender, disabled, illegal immigrant who's blind. That's everybody's going to have some privilege, right? So it becomes this large atonement cult for white people who are, seeking an out, seeking a way to feel better about themselves. And a lot of it also comes down to emotional addiction as well. But that's a whole other topic. So that's a large part of the identity politics of the left, right? It's based on kind of this notion of oppression, this really stale, dogmatic view of identity, 2D caricatures, Edward Said kind of notion of oppressor-oppressed. And it's created a lot of opportunities, right, for grifters, for academic grifters, for people who essentially make careers based on hating the system, hating the man, so to speak. But, whenever you question these people, they don't have a lot to say. I mean, if you're the white kid in an undergrad philosophy class or sociology class, and you have the troll South Asian, sociology professor, immigrant professor who hates colonialism, hates the West, well, who really has the power in that situation? She can go on and on and on about colonialism and history and yada, 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 but she's the teacher, you're the student. Who's got the power in that situation? So it's a very superficial, caricatured story fantasy book version of power, first of all, that people opportunistically use oftentimes, whether to advance their own careers or to, as white people, feel validated. Now, of course, this weird, degenerate-minded left-wing way of looking at the world, it makes one huge fatal flaw, and that's assuming that all people process experiences the same way, right? Not everybody is a weak, dependent leftist who feels like any sort of struggle is this huge oppression, right? Who feels like power is oppressive rather than incompetence. So, we have this kind of notion of identity politics that assumes like every black person must be the same. So in a way, it's a really kind of disgusting way of viewing people. It's viewing people based on these abstractions of who you think they should be, rather than who they are, right? It's looking at a kind of stereotype this one in a positive way. It's, whitey bad, everybody else good, colonized people good. It's looking at people in this very abstracted, sort of stereotyped way, and not really caring too much about their character other than their opinions, right? As long as they toe the kind of left-wing line, good. But otherwise, you're just kind of like boiling people down to this tick chart of so-called oppressions. You're not really looking at them as individuals. You don't really care about, again, their characters, their virtues, how they treat other people, how they handle themselves in the world. So again, it's a very, very gross way of looking at people, a very instrumentalist, 2D way of looking at people. It's often self-serving, right? And it's often part of a pattern of abusive behavior. The same sort of people who look at the world this way, like I mentioned earlier, they're very self-serving, and they're more than happy to treat people as instruments. So now it's time to talk about right-wing identity politics. And before we talk about what that is, I think it's important to talk about what it's not. Now, the first thing it's not is a faggy LARP, right? It's not fucking you setting your PFP, your profile picture on Telegram to a Nazi anime, and then, it's fucking gay, right? And it's not this kind of everything is aesthetics. That's another big problem. Like, people tend to have a very superficial view of politics, whether it's tradconism or, the return meme, the sort of Bapism. So the problem with aesthetics is that it's just that. It's aesthetics. It's superficial. And you see this around the world, right? You have this kind of cultural aesthetic of places. You have the holiday decorations and things like that. But what is it covering? It's covering the same fucking, the skyscrapers, the globo homo. So we need to be careful with that. We need to be careful of identity politics merely as aesthetics, merely as a kind of LARP of what something should look like. And instead, we need to have an identity politics that is based, like the left, the personal is political, but rather based on individual character. So again, what does that mean? What is character? Character is those kind of traits that you develop as a person over time, or that you preserve even, right? Purity, innocence are also character traits. But they're parts of you that are demonstration of some sort of work, at least a positive character trait, right? It's something that takes time to develop. It's something that is a little bit more durable than just, let's say, an action, right? So character traits are essentially built through action. They're built through habitual action. You do something many times, and it becomes a character trait, right? You take a lot of courageous action, you become a courageous person. You go out of your way to help people, you develop a habit of helpfulness, and you become a helpful person, a caring person. It's really quite simple. So, right-wing identity politics is essentially identity politics of individual character. It's looking at what people are doing in life, what they have done in life, where they've started, where they've gone to, and making determinations based on that. That being the primary thing, not simply what they look like. Well, I mean, physiognomy is real, and obviously physical characteristics are a reflection of the internal, but not necessarily, say, somebody's skin color, right? There's plenty of really faggy white people and really based on it mutts, black people, those sorts of things. So again, it's the identity politics of what people are in essence, what they're doing, what kind of habits they have, what sort of character they have, how they treat other people. Do they have actual power, right? Or are they kind of seething? Are they speaking from a place of resentful powerlessness? So what we need to do is we need to avoid the kind of SJW sleight of hand of using these abstractions to cover up from immediate reality, right? We need to quit LARPing about white identity and pretending like that is a stand-in for actual virtue, for actual character, and for how people actually act. You know, like I mentioned, there's tons of fat white people, virtueless white people, tons of virtueless people who go to church. There's, probably more than there are virtuous ones. So we need to, again, adopt this kind of identity politics based on virtue, based on action. So things like strength, both mental and physical strength. Two different types of strength. Like I said, courage. Are you the sort of person that takes risks, or are you fearful? Are you a pussy? Be honest. If you're young, you're probably a pussy. This world is kind of set up to make you a pussy, quite honestly. It kind of shames you for being courageous. Oh, why did you do that? I mean, that's kind of the default response to somebody who does something courageous. Why did you do that? Why do you, the modern world is completely gay, right? It wants you to sit in front of a fucking screen and shoot people on Halo rather than go out and jump off a fucking cliff or talk to a girl. So, jump off a cliff into water, obviously. Other sorts of virtues that go along with this right-wing identity politics, things like honor. Can you be trusted to do the right thing? Do people believe your word? Do you believe your word? That's a good question, actually. Do you trust yourself to do the right thing? These are even deeper questions. Do you fulfill the duties that you have when nobody is looking? Do you do them well? Or do you just do them to the minimum amount necessary? So this is a huge virtue in and of itself. Is somebody honorable? Again, do they do the right thing without you having to look over their fucking shoulder? Another thing is mastery. So the virtue of mastery. Has somebody taken the time, have they exhibited the persistence, the patience to develop and master useful skills? This is a very masculine trait. We value people that can do things that we can't do. And obviously nobody can do everything, right? You're not gonna be a genius computer software developer and a championship boxer and a masterful artist and a piano player and also a socialite at the same time. That's just simply not going to happen. But you still need to develop different skills, and you need to lock down specific ones. You need to pick something, right? Pick a skill that you want to work on right now and work on it for 4 days a week, 5 days a week, maybe 6 days a week. And do that for a year, 2 years, 3 years. And you'll be really good at it, right? You'll be the top 1%, top 0.1% of that skill. And you can do that with more than one skill, right? Like, you have 2-year blocks that you can dedicate to things, and you can become very, very good at things as long as you focus with persistence, with patience. And whenever you do that, it will help you throughout your life, right? Now you have the skill that, at the very minimum, you can get people to pay you to teach them. But just simply, it gives you more optionality. It gives you more capability to contribute to others, to provide value to others. So obviously that's a good thing. That's something that people need. It's very easy to, in a way, success in life is just making yourself valuable to others, right? But going back to the politics of identity, right-wing identity. So to kind of wrap up, to get towards the conclusion, I think it's important to note, extremely important to note actually, that all identity is made up, right? It's all socially constructed. White identity, there wasn't even a such thing as white identity 200 years ago. White people were killing each other. and wars, periodic wars for thousands of years. So there was this notion of like, pan-European identity. It's a very new thing in and of itself. But I think we need to go even further than that, and we need to identify those actual virtues that we want to promote and that will make us successful, and construct an identity around that. So we need to start doing that now, right? And part of our political goals is creating a political system that creates and cultivates a strong identity, an identity that leads towards success. And it also kind of gives us an impetus to create that, make that as part of our political movement, right? Our political movement has a component of identity politics, and that identity politics is an identity politics of virtue, of taking action, of exhibiting those positive character traits that not only help people succeed today, but are also those character traits that we'd like to see on a more widespread basis, right? We'd like to see a state that directly intervenes to cultivate and promote those sorts of character traits among the population, right? We don't want a we don't want a state that gives people better lives. We don't want people to have better lives. We want to have better people, right? We want a state that makes better people. So it's a very fine distinction, but a very, very important one. So again, all identities are made up. They're socially constructed. We can construct new identities. And it's much better to construct them along actual virtues rather than white identity. White identity, even though 60% of whites are completely paused or completely degenerate, or 70% are overweight, something of that nature. So, in conclusion, leftist identity politics is often ego-aggrandizing, vapid moral posturing, right? It's, here's this valuation scale based on power. If you have power, even though you really don't, if you're the white guy in Ohio who makes $36,000 a year, you're a bad person. And I'm good for saying that. So, that's kind of like the leftist identity politics, right? I'm good because I'm telling you what's bad and good. Versus the right-wing identity politics, which identifies those specific habits and actions that lead to success as a general rule, right? That identifies virtues and builds an identity around that. So it's a very distinct version of identity politics, right? It's not white identity politics, it's not tradconism, it's not traditional conservatism, it's not even civic nationalism. But it is a right-wing politics in that it embraces the fundamental element of people. Right? People are the most important thing. If you have a nation of shit people, you have a shit nation. Without good people, you don't have much. This was implicitly recognized by the founding fathers, right? They're like, if you don't have an educated population, you have no republican democracy. You need a moral and educated people for this system to work. So we need a system that also creates a moral and educated people. We need a system that creates a virtuous people, and we need to be able to identify what that is. And that is our politics, in essence. Kind of identifying and promoting virtue. So, if you enjoyed this episode of the Will to Power podcast, I strongly encourage you to subscribe. Please leave a comment. Let me know what you liked about this episode. Share it with your friends or on social media, and I will catch you next time. Peace.